This case is without a doubt the most aggravated and egregious case of torture this court has ever witnessed.
Torture committed by 37-year-old Isauro Aguirre and his 34-year-old girlfriend, Pearl Fernandez, the mother of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez.
Conduct was horrendous, inhumane, and nothing short of evil. The repeated beatings, burning, starving, binding, shooting Gabriel with BBs that were embedded in different parts of his body, knocking his teeth out with a bat, locking him in a dark cabinet while he's bound, and starving this poor child. It is unimaginable.
The judge handed down the sentence. First, Gabriel's mother.
The defendant shall be sentenced to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Defendant Isauro Aguirre shall be put to death within the walls of the California State Prison at San Quentin. You want to say that the conduct was animalistic, but that would be wrong, because even animals know how to take care of their young.
There are stories that stay with you long after the final frame fades to black. Stories that don't just break your heart. They challenge everything you thought you knew about safety, trust, and the responsibility we carry for one another. This is Truth Finder Afees. We don't come here to shock you. We don't come here to sensationalize. We come here to look, carefully and unflinchingly, at the human cost of silence, at the machinery of failure, at what happens when the systems built to protect the most vulnerable among us look the other way. Tonight, we examine one of the most haunting child abuse cases in modern American history. A case that exposed not one failure, but dozens. Not one missed sign, but a cascading series of ignored warnings that stretched across months, across institutions, across the ordinary rhythms of everyday life. This is the story of Gabriel Fernandez, an 8-year-old boy who reached out for help and was never truly reached back.
A Los Angeles County judge denied a resentencing request from the mother who helped kill her 8-year-old son. The 2013 tortured death of Gabriel Fernandez and resulting high-profile case was featured in a popular 2020 Netflix documentary. Pearl Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after she pled guilty to the murder of her son, along with a special circumstance, a murder involving torture. Her boyfriend also received the death penalty after he was convicted in Gabriel's death.
Palmdale, California, a sprawling desert city at the edge of the Antelope Valley, roughly 70 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. It is the kind of place that exists in the geography of the ordinary: strip malls and residential blocks, school buses in the morning, sprinklers running in the afternoon heat. A community like thousands of others across America. Quiet, unremarkable, safe on the surface. It was here, in a modest apartment on East Avenue S, that a little boy named Gabriel Fernandez lived out the final months of his short life. To the outside world, Gabriel was just another child in a crowded California school district. He was 8 years old. He had dark eyes and a wide smile that photographs from his earlier years captured with the uncomplicated joy that belongs only to children. Those who knew him from his time with his great-uncle and his uncle's partner, the two men who raised him for much of his early life, described a boy who was affectionate and warm. The staff at his great-uncle's workplace, where Gabriel sometimes visited, had given him a nickname, Shaggy. He was, by all accounts, a child who wanted connection, who leaned into kindness wherever he found it. But by the autumn of 2012, something had changed. Gabriel had come to live with his biological mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. And the boy who arrived at Summerwind Elementary School in Palmdale that October was different from the child who had once smiled easily for photographs. He was quieter, more watchful, and beneath his clothing, there were things that would soon become impossible to ignore. The question that haunts every chapter of this story is the same one that haunted everyone who encountered Gabriel during those final months. How could so many people see him and still not see what was happening to him? How could warning signs accumulate for 7 months, reported and documented and filed and forgotten, while one small boy remained unprotected in the home that was supposed to be his refuge? This is not a story about a mystery. There is no whodunit here. The truth of what happened to Gabriel Fernandez is documented in court records, trial testimony, investigative reports, and the quiet anguish of everyone who failed to act in time. This is a story about something far more disturbing than a mystery. It is a story about how abuse hides in plain sight, about how institutions built to protect children can become so burdened, so bureaucratic, so ideologically compromised, that they lose sight of the child standing right in front of them, about how ordinary-looking households can conceal extraordinary cruelty, and how, in Gabriel's case, the concealment held long enough to cost him everything. We begin at the beginning, not with the end, though the end is where this story echoes loudest. We begin with a child, and with the world that was supposed to hold him.
Gabriel is my little angel, our little angel that is going to be protecting us, and he's going to give us an extra day, an extra year to give us ganas to continue our fight for this.
This was Pearl Fernandez's second attempt at resentencing since she was sentenced to life in prison in June of 2018.
Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was born on February 20th, 2005. From the very first days of his life, he was caught in the particular vulnerability that comes when the person meant to love you most is also the person least equipped to do so. His mother, Pearl Fernandez, left him at the hospital 3 days after his birth. The reasons were complex. Pearl herself carried the scars of a deeply troubled childhood, one marked by neglect, instability, trauma, and early exposure to substance abuse. By her own account, she had begun using drugs at the age of 9. She had dropped out of school in the 8th grade. She had endured violence, upheaval, and a life that had given her few of the tools that parenting requires. Clinical evaluations conducted years later would reveal cognitive and emotional deficits significant enough that psychologists described her as someone who was, in their words, virtually unable to use thought to guide her own behavior and regulate her emotional reactions. None of this excuses what was to come, but it matters for understanding how the household that Gabriel eventually entered was not simply a place of cruelty. It was a place where dysfunction had become the baseline, where the adults in authority were themselves profoundly damaged. For most of his early life, Gabriel was shielded from the worst of it. He lived with his great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and Carranza's partner, David Martinez. He was cared for. He was nicknamed. He was known. Then, in 2012, Pearl Fernandez, who had by this point reconnected with a man named Isoro Aguirre, made a decision that would alter the course of Gabriel's life entirely. She sought custody of her son, arguing that Gabriel was not being properly looked after. DCFS, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, completed its review and, despite a history of concerns attached to Pearl's household, returned Gabriel to his mother's care. It is worth pausing here, because the department that made that decision, the department that placed Gabriel back in his mother's apartment, had, by this point, received dozens of complaints relating to Pearl Fernandez's household going back years. Some reports would later suggest the number reached as high as 60 documented complaints over the course of a decade. Multiple investigations had been opened. Multiple investigations had been closed, their findings logged as inconclusive or unfounded. Gabriel moved in with Pearl and Aguirre in October 2012. Within days, his teacher began to notice something wrong. It is a detail that carries its own particular weight. Within days, not weeks, not after some period of adjustment or settling in. Within days of arriving in that apartment, Gabriel Fernandez was already carrying visible evidence of what was happening behind its walls. And yet the walls held. For 7 more months, they held.
That's right. A tragic chapter in the story of little Gabriel Fernandez ending today. No one who saw his injuries stepped in to save him. Only through this trial were all his wounds and injuries exposed. Now Aguirre is the first to pay the price. From the day paramedics tried to revive 8-year-old Gabriel to today's verdict. 4.5 years to assemble a capital case against Isoro Aguirre. The outcome personal to the prosecutor, Jonathan Hatami.
The most important.
Understanding what unfolded inside that apartment requires understanding the psychology of abuse. Specifically, the way cruelty can escalate in environments where power is unchecked and accountability is absent. Prosecutors, drawing on evidence gathered after Gabriel's death, described a pattern of abuse that began shortly after Gabriel moved in and grew progressively worse with each passing month. The abuse was not spontaneous. It was not random. It followed a logic of dominance and control, one in which Gabriel's suffering was, in the most deeply disturbing sense, deliberate. Isoro Aguirre, Pearl's boyfriend, became the primary orchestrator of much of the abuse Gabriel endured. Investigators later presented testimony that Aguirre harbored particular hostility toward Gabriel rooted in his belief that the boy was gay, a belief that appears to have driven an escalating campaign of cruelty directed specifically at the child. Pearl, though she would later accept a guilty plea to avoid the death penalty, was described by witnesses and the prosecution as an active participant, not merely a bystander. Gabriel's own siblings, who lived in the home, would eventually testify to what they witnessed. Their testimony painted a portrait of a household that had inverted every expectation of what a home should be. They described being made to participate in humiliating rituals directed at their brother. They described Aguirre and Pearl laughing while inflicting harm. They described a child who was denied food, forced to eat things no person should be forced to endure, and who slept in conditions designed to degrade rather than shelter. What the siblings also described, and what matters profoundly for understanding why the abuse went undetected for so long, was the enforcement of silence. Children who live inside abusive households do not simply fail to speak. They are taught not to speak. They learn, through repetition and consequence, that speaking brings punishment, that the person they might tell cannot be trusted, that the world outside the front door is either unreachable or indifferent. Gabriel's siblings were controlled by fear, and Gabriel himself, despite the extraordinary courage it took to reach out, even partially, to the adults around him, was caught in the same terrible architecture of silence and concealment that defines abuse at its most calculated. This is the psychological reality that no hotline protocol, no case file, no home visit can fully penetrate without commitment, without time, and without someone who is willing to look past the surface. The bruises told part of the story. The behavior told more. And still, the months continued.
The most important job, like I said in closing, is to be a dad. I love my job as a prosecutor, but my number one job is being a dad. So I might think that, sorry.
Hatami disclosing just today he knows how child cruelty feels.
I was a victim of child abuse, and so, it's difficult to deal with.
Aguirre was found guilty of murder in the first degree. His final beating of Gabriel ended the child's life, but evidence proved that Gabriel's pathway to death began 8 months earlier. Premeditated and intentional. Gabriel was fed cat litter, cat feces, slept gagged and handcuffed in a cabinet. Then there were the beatings.
He had 9 old broken ribs, 3 new broken ribs. He had 4 teeth knocked out. He was in a condition that he was dying. And he hadn't been to the doctor in 8 months. And as a result of that, his body was very fragile.
The case scandalized the Department of Child and Family Services. 4 workers are charged with felonies for their alleged failures. Today, the defendant's mother says she never saw any sign of abuse. From Gabriel's extended family, mixed feelings.
Because the win would have been Gabriel's still alive. But it is, in fact, we no longer have to worry about this particular person out on the streets doing this to another child.
If there is a chapter in this story that demands the most careful attention, the most deliberate slowness, it is this one. Because what happened at Summerwind Elementary School in Palmdale, California, between October 2012 and May 2013 is both a testament to the moral courage of one educator and a damning chronicle of institutional failure so complete it seems, even now, almost incomprehensible. Her name was Jennifer Garcia. She was Gabriel's first-grade teacher. Within weeks of Gabriel arriving in her class, Garcia began to see things that unsettled her. Gabriel was quieter than the other children. He flinched in ways that didn't fit the easy carelessness of childhood. And then, one day in October 2012, he asked her something. He asked whether it was normal for a mom to hit her kids with the buckle end of a belt. He asked whether it was normal to bleed. Jennifer Garcia went home that afternoon and called the child abuse hotline. The call was documented. A caseworker named Stephanie Rodriguez, a relatively new employee at DCFS, was assigned to Gabriel's case. Rodriguez visited the apartment. She noted that the children appeared appropriately dressed and that no visible marks or bruises were evident at the time of her visit. She spoke with Pearl Fernandez. She did not conduct a private interview with Gabriel himself. The case was logged as not requiring immediate action. And then the months began. In November 2012, Gabriel came to school with chunks of his hair missing. Garcia called again. In December, he arrived with an injured lip and told his teacher that his mother had punched him. Garcia called again. In January 2013, Gabriel appeared in class with round, distinctive bruises on his face. He told Garcia that he had been shot with a BB gun. Garcia called again. Each time, she was told that a social worker would follow up. Each time, her calls and voicemails often went unanswered. Each time, she returned to her classroom and looked at a little boy who was wearing the evidence of what was happening to him as clearly as he wore his school clothes. And she did the thing that the system was supposed to make possible. She reported it. She kept reporting it. What she did not know, what she had no way of fully knowing, was that the machinery designed to respond to her calls was not functioning. Rodriguez had visited the home multiple times. Gabriel, in those visits, frequently recanted his accounts. This is not unusual. Children who are being abused often recant when questioned in environments where they feel unsafe, or when they fear the consequences of disclosure. It is a well-documented phenomenon, one that any trained investigator should recognize as a warning sign in itself rather than evidence of untruth. But Rodriguez's case notes repeatedly reflected a household that appeared stable. There were no medical assessments ordered for Gabriel despite the escalating pattern of injuries. Rodriguez reportedly spoke only with Pearl during home visits, not with Gabriel in private. When a supervisor reviewed the case, the paperwork suggested a child who was being monitored appropriately. What the paperwork did not reflect was the reality inside that apartment. Meanwhile, another mandated reporter had also come into contact with Gabriel. A counselor from an outside agency named Barbara Dixon, working for a contractor called Hathaway Sycamore's Child and Family Services, visited the home during 2013 and found Gabriel limping, with a black eye, scrapes across his face, and bruising on his wrists and ankles. Dixon initially accepted the family's explanation that Gabriel had fallen from a bike. But after speaking with him on a walk, she came to doubt that account. Dixon later testified that she reported her concerns to her supervisor at Hathaway Sycamore's. Her supervisor reportedly told her not to report the abuse to child welfare authorities. Dixon complied. The agency was, at the time, receiving tens of millions of dollars annually in county contracts. The institutional dynamics, the pressure to protect relationships, to avoid conflict, to keep cases moving smoothly through a system under strain, appear to have mattered more, in that moment, than the bruises on Gabriel Fernandez's face. And all the while, the case remained open, logged, assigned, reviewed by supervisors who were, according to prosecutors, either approving falsified reports or failing to recognize that the documentation they were signing did not match the evidence of a child in accelerating danger. The system had built-in checkpoints. Those checkpoints existed on paper, and on paper they appeared to be working. Behind closed doors, a child was running out of time. There is a particular cruelty in the final chapter of Gabriel's life that goes beyond the physical events themselves. It lies in the timing. On May 9, 2013, just 2 weeks before Gabriel would be found unresponsive in the apartment, the DCFS caseworker assigned to his case formally closed it. The rationale logged in the file suggested the family's situation had stabilized, that the concerns which had generated months of calls, reports, and home visits had been resolved. 3 weeks later, Gabriel Fernandez was dead. The gap between those two facts, the closing of the case and the death of the child it was meant to protect, is not just a timeline. It is a moral indictment. On the evening of May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911. She told the dispatcher that her son had stopped breathing after hitting his head. Paramedics arrived at the apartment and found Gabriel on the floor, unresponsive. What they saw in those first moments was enough to tell them that this was not a fall. This was not an accident. Gabriel was transported to a hospital. The emergency staff who received him would later describe injuries that reflected sustained and severe abuse rather than any single traumatic event. He had a fractured skull, swelling on the brain, broken ribs, missing teeth, BB pellet wounds across his body. There were signs of restraint, marks on his wrists and ankles consistent with having been bound. He was 8 years old. The medical team fought to save him, but Gabriel was declared brain dead. For 2 days he held on in a state beyond reach. His great-uncle and the partner who had raised him as a small child, the two men who had nicknamed him Shaggy and watched him laugh, arrived at the hospital. On May 24, 2013, Gabriel Daniel Fernandez died. On the same day, Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre were arrested on charges that would ultimately be elevated to first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. It was, in the most agonizing sense, too late for the only outcome that mattered. In the days and weeks that followed Gabriel's death, investigators began to reconstruct the 7 months that had led to it. What they found was not a single catastrophic error. It was a pattern, a layering of institutional decisions and individual failures that, taken together, had functioned as effectively as a locked door. Prosecutors would later allege that 2 of the DCFS caseworkers assigned to Gabriel's case, Stephanie Rodriguez and Patricia Clement, had falsified reports that should have documented his worsening injuries and the family's failure to cooperate with the department's services. Their supervisors, Kevin Bom and Gregory Merritt, were accused of approving reports that either didn't reflect the evidence or were grossly negligent in their oversight. In April 2016, 3 years after Gabriel's death, all 4 social workers were criminally charged. It was a historic moment. It marked the first time in Los Angeles County history that child welfare workers had faced criminal prosecution for misconduct directly tied to a child's death. Prosecutors described their conduct as a willful disregard for Gabriel's well-being, language that carried significant moral weight given the nature of their professional mandate. But the criminal process did not reach the conclusion that many had hoped for. In 2020, an appeals court dismissed the charges against all 4 workers. The court found that the legal standard required to hold social workers criminally liable for the deaths of children in their caseloads had not been met. The social workers were found, in the language of the ruling, factually innocent of the charges. They had already been fired from the department, but they would not face prison. For Gabriel's family, for the great-uncle and partner who had raised him, for the grandparents who had sought to protect him, for the teacher who had made call after call while watching his injuries worsen, the ruling was devastating. Not because accountability in the legal sense is simple, but because the absence of consequences felt like a confirmation of what the case had already demonstrated. That within large, burdened institutions, it is possible for catastrophic failures to occur and for no individual to be held fully responsible. This is one of the most difficult psychological realities this case forces us to confront. Evil, in its most dramatic forms, is committed by individuals. But harm on the scale of what happened to Gabriel Fernandez often requires something more systemic. It requires bureaucracies that substitute documentation for genuine inquiry. It requires cultures that prioritize smooth case management over uncomfortable truths. It requires individual actors who are exhausted or undertrained or simply unwilling to look past what the paperwork tells them. Investigators also learned details about the specific dynamics of the household that deepened the horror of what Gabriel had endured. His siblings testified to the daily reality of life in the apartment. They described Gabriel being locked inside a small cabinet as punishment. They described him being bound and gagged. They described the particular cruelty of Aguirre, who appears to have targeted Gabriel with particular intensity. Rooted, prosecutors argued, in homophobia and the particular violence of a man who needed to assert dominance over a small child who had no power to resist. Pearl Fernandez accepted a plea deal in 2018, pleading guilty to first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She avoided the death penalty through the plea. Isoro Aguirre refused to enter a guilty plea. His trial proceeded, and in 2018, after a jury heard weeks of evidence, including testimony from Gabriel's own siblings, he was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. He was sentenced to death. As of the time of this documentary, he remains on death row in California, where a governor's moratorium on executions means his sentence is indefinitely suspended. The perpetrators are behind bars. The people who were supposed to protect Gabriel are free, and Gabriel himself is gone at the age of 8, in the spring of 2013, in a city 70 miles from nowhere that most of the country had never heard of. In the months and years after Gabriel's death, Los Angeles County was forced to reckon with what had happened on its watch. The reckoning was substantial. Public protests drew thousands of people into the streets. A blue ribbon commission was convened to examine the systemic failures that had allowed the case to reach its conclusion. The commission's final report, delivered in April 2014, was described as scathing, a word that suggests how thoroughly the investigation found that the failures were not isolated but structural. Among the most significant findings was this. In the period leading up to Gabriel's death, social workers in Los Angeles County were carrying caseloads that bore no relationship to safe or effective practice. State law suggested an optimal ratio of 15 cases per worker. In reality, workers were managing 50-60 cases at a time. At least one supervisor connected to Gabriel's case was reportedly responsible for oversight of 280 children. 280 children. It is almost impossible to hold that number in mind alongside the specific image of one boy sitting in a classroom, asking his teacher whether it was normal to bleed. The system was not designed to fail Gabriel, but it had been allowed to reach a state in which failure was the path of least resistance, where documentation could substitute for action, where overworked workers could approve reports they hadn't adequately reviewed, where ideological pressures within the child welfare system toward family preservation had reduced the likelihood that a child in danger would be removed from a home, even when the signs were visible and reported and documented. Investigators also learned that the Antelope Valley region where Gabriel lived, roughly 70 miles from downtown Los Angeles, was chronically understaffed. The area had a documented child poverty rate significantly higher than the national average. Workers did not want to be placed there. Retention was a persistent problem. The children who most needed oversight lived in the place that the system had the most difficulty reaching. The reforms that followed Gabriel's death were genuine, if incomplete. The county invested in hiring thousands of new social workers. Caseload caps were eventually negotiated into union contracts. A DCFS training facility was established, incorporating lessons from Gabriel's case. USC's School of Social Work reported that a full third of new students cited Gabriel's story as part of their motivation for entering the field. These are meaningful changes. They matter. But the case also raised questions that institutional reform alone cannot fully answer. What does it mean that a counselor who saw Gabriel limping and bruised was told by her supervisors not to report it, and complied? What does it mean that a social worker could visit a home where a child was being harmed and see nothing actionable? What does it mean that a case could be closed in the third week of May 2013 and a child in that same case could be dead by the end of the month? The answer is not simple. It involves the psychology of conformity in institutional settings, the way professional norms can override individual moral judgment, the cognitive shortcuts that busy people rely on when they are overwhelmed, and the way those shortcuts in child welfare work can have irreversible consequences. It involves understanding that mandated reporting works only when the reports are taken seriously. That documentation is not the same as protection. That a home visit in which a social worker speaks only to the suspected abuser and not to the child in private is not a real investigation. It is theater. And that bureaucratic closure is not the same as safety. It involves understanding, most painfully, that Gabriel Fernandez did not die because no one knew. He died because knowing is not the same as acting. There is a moment in cases like this one when the weight of the facts begins to feel less like information and more like grief. We have walked through 7 months of a child's life. We have traced the arc of warning signs, the questions asked of a teacher, the calls made to a hotline, the bruises that didn't match the explanations given, the case file that grew thicker even as the child inside it grew more endangered. We have watched the machinery of protection fail at every point where it was supposed to engage. And now we are here at the end, where there is no resolution that feels adequate. Because the only resolution that would have mattered is the one that didn't come. Gabriel Fernandez deserved to grow up. He deserved to go to school and make friends and find out what kind of person he was becoming. He deserved the ordinary accumulation of days that every child is owed. He was curious. He was capable of connection. He was a child who, despite everything, was still trying to communicate. Still asking his teacher whether what was happening to him was normal, still existing in a world that he hoped might respond to him. It did not respond in time. Or rather, parts of it tried and were failed by the parts that didn't. Jennifer Garcia, the teacher who made call after call while watching Gabriel come to school with new injuries, has spoken about the weight of those months. About the sense that she was doing the right thing, the thing the system said would work, and watching it not work in real time. Her experience is a portrait of what it means to bear witness to something that cannot be stopped through the channels that are supposed to stop it. The great-uncle who raised Gabriel from infancy and called him Shaggy knew something was wrong when custody was transferred to Pearl. The grandparents who had also cared for Gabriel knew. They filed a lawsuit against the county in the aftermath, arguing that DCFS had made a catastrophic error in returning Gabriel to his mother despite the history attached to her household. They were right, but they were also powerless to stop it, because the system had made its determination, and overturning institutional decisions requires a level of access and authority that families, particularly families without resources, rarely possess. This is the structural vulnerability that Gabriel's case illuminates most starkly. It is not enough to care about a child. It is not enough to notice. It is not enough even to report. The system that is supposed to transform those individual acts of attention into protection must actually function. It must be adequately resourced, trained, supervised, and committed to treating every report as a serious indication that a child might be in danger. When it fails to function, when it substitutes paperwork for genuine inquiry, ideology for individual assessment, bureaucratic closure for real safety, the consequences fall on the most vulnerable people in the world. On children who cannot advocate for themselves. On children who are taught by their circumstances to absorb suffering in silence. On children like Gabriel. The Netflix documentary series released in 2020, titled The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, brought his story to a global audience and renewed the demand for accountability that had animated the original protests in Palmdale and Los Angeles. Millions of people watched those episodes and asked the same question that everyone who learns this case eventually asks. How was this allowed to continue? The question is not rhetorical. It has specific answers, documented and verifiable. Excessive caseloads, inadequate supervision, falsified reports, a culture of family preservation that reduced the use of protective removal even when children were at risk. Institutional pressures that made it easier to close a case than to pursue it. A geographic and resource disparity that left the most vulnerable communities with the least support. Those are the answers, and they are inadequate in the way that all institutional answers to individual suffering are inadequate, because they describe how the machinery broke without fully capturing what the breaking cost. What it cost was a child's life. Gabriel Fernandez, February 20th, 2005 to May 24th, 2013. 8 years old. He existed in this world for 8 years. For the last 7 months of those 8 years, he was being harmed in ways that the people around him could see, and the system that was supposed to respond to what they saw could not bring itself to act. What does a child's life demand of us? It demands that we take warning signs seriously. It demands that when a teacher calls a hotline repeatedly, someone investigates, genuinely investigates, speaking to the child alone, ordering medical assessments, following up within days and not weeks. It demands that when a counselor sees a limping child with a black eye and bruised wrists, she reports what she sees regardless of institutional pressure. It demands that when a case file grows heavier and the explanations offered grow less plausible, someone with authority asks the harder question instead of approving the easier paperwork. It demands that we do not substitute proximity for safety, that we do not assume a child is protected simply because someone in authority has been assigned to look after them. It demands, in the plainest terms, that we do not look away. Gabriel Fernandez could not protect himself. He was a child. The protection he needed was the protection that every child is supposed to be given by the world that surrounds them, by teachers and counselors and caseworkers and neighbors and systems of care that are funded and staffed and committed enough to function when it matters most. He reached for that protection. He asked for it in the only language available to an 8-year-old boy, by asking his teacher whether it was normal to bleed. The system heard him, and then it looked away. We are left, at the end of this story, with the image of a child who deserved more than the world gave him. With the weight of 7 months of documented warning signs that led to a conclusion that should never have been reached. With the knowledge that the failures were not inevitable, that different decisions made at different points could have brought Gabriel safely out of that apartment and into a life he deserved to live. And we are left with the responsibility that every person who hears a story like this carries forward. The responsibility to take warning signs seriously, to report, to follow up, to demand that the institutions designed to protect children actually function, to understand that abuse does not announce itself. It conceals itself, hides behind ordinary facades, counts on the discomfort and distraction and institutional inertia of the world outside the door. Gabriel Fernandez could not survive on hope alone. He needed action. In his memory, and in the memory of every child whose suffering went unseen or unaddressed, the only response adequate to the weight of this story is commitment. Commitment to looking. Commitment to acting. Commitment to making sure that the next teacher who calls a hotline does not spend 7 months watching a child's injuries worsen while the machinery grinds on without resolution. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez, February 20th, 2005 to May 24th, 2013. 8 years old. He deserved to see 9.